Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. Carl Jung documented something that made even seasoned psychologists deeply uneasy. When empaths heal their deepest wound, the people they attract change instantly. Not gradually, not symbolically, instantly. Jung was explicit about this point. This was not wishful thinking, not spiritual fantasy, not motivational psychology. It was a structural transformation of the psyche so complete that it altered relational gravity itself. And Jung described this shift with a word rarely associated with healing: terrifying. But what makes this transformation truly unsettling is not its intensity. It is its precision. Because the empath's core wound is almost always misunderstood, even by the empath themselves. It is not trauma alone, not abandonment, not sensitivity, not kindness taken too far. The core wound Jung identified was far more subtle and far more dangerous. The empath suppresses their own perception in order to preserve attachment to people who cannot tolerate being seen clearly. This single act, repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, fractures the psyche. Jung spent years observing empaths who arrived at his clinic in a state of quiet devastation. They did not present as dramatic. They did not accuse. They did not rage. They apologized. They apologized for existing, for speaking, for needing, for noticing. They blamed themselves instinctively for every rupture in every relationship they had ever entered. They endured emotional abuse without naming it as abuse. They absorbed infidelity, addiction, rage, and dysfunction without protest. Jung described them as emotional shock absorbers for entire systems. They carried alcoholic parents. They carried unstable partners. They carried families that could not regulate themselves. And they did it silently, relentlessly, with devastating loyalty. What unsettled Jung was not the suffering. It was the pattern beneath it. These were not random victims. They shared a precise psychological configuration. Jung called it differentiated intuitive perception. An advanced capacity to detect micro-expressions, to register emotional incongruence, to sense unconscious tension long before it becomes visible behavior. They perceived psychological patterns that escaped everyone else in the room. To test this, Jung conducted quiet experiments. He would bring colleagues into sessions without providing any information. Within minutes, empathic patients identified childhood wounds, relational patterns, and core insecurities with uncanny accuracy. One patient achieved a documented accuracy rate of 97% when reading strangers she had never met. This was not mysticism, not psychic ability. This was the human brain operating at an extreme level of pattern recognition. Jung realized something that overturned his understanding of pathology. These individuals were not broken by abuse. They had been studying it. Every empath Jung documented carried a detailed internal archive of every person who had ever harmed them. They knew triggers, defense mechanisms, core fears, unconscious motives. They mapped emotional terrain with surgical precision. Yet they never used this knowledge. Not once. Until something inside them collapsed. That was the moment Jung recognized he was not treating victims. He was observing psychological strategists in hiding. Minds that functioned like war rooms, dormant, restrained, ethically bound, waiting for activation. And when that activation came, when the empath finally healed their core wound, the transformation was not subtle. It was absolute. The person who had been underestimated for decades became structurally unreachable. Manipulation failed. Validation dependency vanished. Boundaries emerged with a solidity that shocked everyone who had benefited from their permeability. People who once apologized for breathing began saying no without explanation. And Jung realized something chilling. Nothing about their intelligence had increased. Nothing about their perception had changed. What changed was permission. They stopped suppressing what they saw. Jung identified the empath's core wound with unsettling clarity. It was not that they saw too much. It was that they learned to pretend they did not see at all. From early childhood, the empath discovers a dangerous truth. Seeing clearly destabilizes attachment. When the empath names what is emotionally obvious, discomfort follows. When they point out inconsistency, tension arises. When they sense manipulation, they are accused of being dramatic, sensitive, or cruel. So they adapt. Not consciously, instinctively. The empath learns to down-regulate their perception in order to preserve connection. They begin to doubt what they know. They soften what they see. They translate truth into palatable fragments. Jung observed this pattern across hundreds of cases. The empath child says, "Something is wrong." The adult replies, "Nothing is wrong, you're imagining things." The empath learns the most dangerous lesson of all. Their perception threatens love. And so the split begins. One part of the psyche continues to see clearly. Another part pretends not to. Jung called this double consciousness. A divided inner life where intuition functions flawlessly, but expression is censored. This split becomes the empath's core wound. Not because perception is wrong, but because perception is silenced. And this wound determines attraction with mathematical precision. When empaths suppress perception, they broadcast an unconscious signal. I will not confront what I see. Manipulators feel this immediately, not intellectually, somatically. Predators are drawn not to blindness, but to self-distrust. They sense someone who sees everything yet doubts themselves. Someone who can be convinced they are wrong. Someone whose clarity can be overridden by guilt. Jung described this dynamic as an unconscious contract. The empath agrees to doubt their perception. The manipulator agrees to exploit that doubt. Neither party articulates this agreement. That is why it works. The pattern repeats relentlessly. The manipulator acts. The empath senses danger. The empath questions themselves. The manipulator reinforces doubt. The empath suppresses intelligence. The relationship continues. Jung called this the victim cycle. Not because the empath is weak, but because their greatest strength has been turned inward against them. Each repetition deepens the wound. Each time the empath dismisses their intuition, the psyche absorbs a devastating message. I cannot trust myself. This is why empaths often develop what Jung identified as the apology complex. They apologize for existing, for reacting, for needing, for noticing. Apology becomes a reflex, a survival mechanism, a way to preempt rejection. But Jung observed something extraordinary. This cycle does not end gradually. It ends violently. Not with screaming, not with confrontation, but with a single psychological rupture so profound that suppression becomes impossible. Jung called this shadow integration under extreme duress. The trigger is always the same. A betrayal so undeniable that perception overwhelms denial.
Infidelity, financial manipulation, systematic emotional abuse.
But the devastation is not the act itself. It is the realization. The empath remembers every warning sign, every intuitive hit dismissed as paranoia, every moment of doubt they talked themselves out of. And in that instant, the psyche reassembles. The empath realizes they were never wrong. They were silenced. Jung documented this moment repeatedly, and what followed disturbed him deeply. The empath did not collapse. They became calm. Unnaturally calm. Apologies stopped. Explanations ceased. Emotional bargaining vanished. Instead, something colder and far more precise emerged. Clarity. Jung referred to this moment as the clarity event. The instant when intuition overwhelms the need to believe the best in others. From the outside, it looks like emotional shutdown. From the inside, it is psychological reorganization. The empath does not become cruel, they become exact. They speak truth without heat, without apology, without explanation. They begin to articulate what they have always known. Every lie, every manipulation, every pattern silently endured. Not as accusation, as diagnosis. Jung observed this process with clinical fascination. The empath was not seeking revenge, they were integrating shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not evil. It is the part of the psyche that has been exiled to preserve belonging. For empaths, the shadow contains their most dangerous qualities. Intelligence, perceptual accuracy, strategic thinking, psychological strength. All the traits they were punished for expressing. Shadow integration does not make the empath darker. It makes them whole. They stop minimizing perception. They stop apologizing for clarity. They stop translating truth into comfort. And this completion alters attraction instantly. Jung followed these individuals for years after integration. What he discovered unsettled him. Their lives improved with startling speed. Businesses flourished, relationships stabilized, decision-making became almost flawless. Why? Because they trusted their perception completely. They could read intentions immediately, identify emotional predators within minutes, detect incongruence before damage occurred. But what disturbed Jung most was this. They had not become less empathic. They had become perfectly empathic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They understood human psychology well enough to manipulate others effortlessly, yet they chose not to. They simply withdrew access. Jung realized he was witnessing the emergence of what he called the integrated empath, someone who could feel deeply without drowning, see clearly without attacking, care without sacrificing themselves. And this is where the attraction flip occurs. It happens instantly because the empath's internal signal changes. They no longer broadcast self-doubt. They radiate psychological sovereignty. Manipulators feel this viscerally. They cannot explain why, they simply feel exposed. Gaslighting fails. Guilt dissolves. Emotional hooks find nothing to attach to. Jung described this as the predator instinct in reverse. Just as predators sense vulnerability, they sense impenetrability. They retreat. Meanwhile, psychologically mature individuals are drawn closer. They feel safe being seen, safe being known, safe being held to reality. Jung identified 3 categories of attraction before and after integration. Before healing, manipulators seeking blindness, emotional dependence seeking regulation, other wounded empaths bonding through pain. After healing, integrated individuals who value being seen, those actively engaged in their own growth. Psychologically mature people who neither need fixing nor fixing others. The shift is binary. Before integration, the empath attracts those who need them unconscious. After integration, the empath attracts those who value consciousness. This is not mysticism. It is psychological law. And Jung identified the mechanism precisely. Before healing, the empath operates in participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve, where others' emotions are experienced as one's own, where the self merges with the collective unconscious. This state broadcasts a message. I have no boundaries. The unconscious responds. After healing, the empath develops conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between internal emotion and absorbed content. I can feel you, but I will not carry you. This creates an energetic boundary that is invisible but absolute, and everything changes. Jung described sovereignty as the psychological state where perception no longer seeks permission. The integrated empath does not ask, "Will this upset them?" They ask, "Is this true?" They do not measure worth through approval. They do not adjust reality to preserve comfort. They choose clarity over acceptance. This is why manipulators cannot function around them. Their power was never internal. It was borrowed. Borrowed from the empath's doubt. Borrowed from the empath's need to be liked. Borrowed from the empath's fear of abandonment. When that fear dissolves, the structure collapses. Jung observed that this transformation creates a ripple effect. Families reorganize, friendships recalibrate, workplaces shift. Not through confrontation, through refusal. Refusal to absorb chaos, refusal to regulate others, refusal to betray self. One person who stops participating in dysfunction forces every system around them to reveal its nature. Those willing to grow adapt. Those dependent on exploitation resist or exit. Both outcomes serve individuation. Jung understood that this process is not celebrated. Empaths are often accused of becoming selfish, cold, arrogant. But Jung clarified the reality. The empath did not become selfish, they became self-respecting. They did not lose empathy. They stopped bleeding. They did not harden, they stabilized. This is why Jung considered healed empaths dangerous. Not to healthy people, to unconscious systems. They expose dysfunction simply by existing without distortion. Jung believed that highly perceptive individuals serve an evolutionary function. They sense fractures before collapse. They detect toxicity before catastrophe. They feel collective imbalance before it manifests outwardly. But only integrated empaths can serve this role without self-destruction. Unintegrated perception leads to martyrdom. Integrated perception leads to medicine. This is why Jung insisted that individuation is not selfish. It is a responsibility to develop perception fully, to wield it ethically, to refuse unconscious participation. The empath's greatest tragedy is not sense. Jung observed that once the empath completes this integration, something irreversible occurs. They cannot return to unconscious participation. They may attempt it, they may feel nostalgia for familiarity, but the psyche will not comply. Once perception is trusted, it cannot be untrusted. This is why Jung described individuation as both liberation and burden. You gain clarity, you lose illusions. You gain sovereignty, you lose denial. The empath now sees not only others more clearly but themselves. They recognize how often they tolerated disrespect, how often they negotiated reality, how often they mistook endurance for virtue. This self-recognition is painful, but it is also stabilizing. The empath stops rewriting memory to preserve attachment. They stop minimizing harm. They stop explaining away patterns. Truth becomes the organizing principle, and truth is efficient. Jung noted that after integration, empaths make decisions quickly. They do not deliberate endlessly. They do not rationalize obvious misalignment. They trust the first signal. This is why their lives begin to move rapidly. Careers shift, relationships end, geographic moves happen. Not impulsively, precisely. Jung described this as alignment momentum. When internal conflict dissolves, energy previously used for self-suppression becomes available for action. This is why healed empaths often appear suddenly powerful. Not because they gained something new, because they stopped leaking energy. The empath no longer argues with reality. They respond to it. Jung also warned that this phase attracts projection. Others accuse the empath of being harsh, unforgiving, unchanged but different. What they are responding to is boundary clarity. The empath no longer negotiates basic respect. They do not explain boundaries, they enforce them. And enforcement feels brutal to those accustomed to endless accommodation. But Jung was clear. Boundaries are not aggression, they are orientation. They tell others how to relate, or not relate. This is where the empath becomes psychologically untouchable. Not because they are defended, because they are defined. They know who they are, what they tolerate, what they will not carry. This definition removes ambiguity. And ambiguity was the manipulator's playground. Jung believed that integrated empaths represent a new psychological archetype. Not the wounded healer, the sovereign sensitive. Someone who can see pain without becoming it, who can witness dysfunction without fixing it, who can love without abandoning self. This archetype is rare and necessary. Because unconscious societies require conscious individuals to evolve. But Jung also emphasized humility. The integrated empath does not preach, they do not convert. They do not expose others unnecessarily. They simply live differently. And this difference creates contrast. People feel it, even if they cannot name it. Some are inspired, some are threatened. Both responses confirm the same truth. The empath has exited unconscious participation. And once exited, there is no return. Only deeper embodiment. This is the terrifying transformation Jung documented. Not because it destroys the empath, but because it destroys everything built on their self-denial. And what remains is real. Jung warned that the greatest danger for the empath after awakening is not relapse, but misinterpretation of their own transformation. Many empaths mistake clarity for coldness, distance for cruelty, silence for punishment. Jung rejected this framing entirely. He insisted that what looks like emotional withdrawal is often the psyche restoring its natural boundaries. The empath is not becoming less loving. They are becoming less available for unconscious exchange. There is a profound difference. Unconscious exchange drains. Conscious relationship nourishes. Before integration, the empath confused intensity with intimacy. They believed closeness required suffering, that love meant endurance. Jung traced this belief to early conditioning. When a child learns that connection requires self-erasure, they grow into an adult who confuses pain with proof of love. Healing dismantles this equation. The empath begins to experience relationships without emotional taxation, without constant vigilance, without anticipatory anxiety. At first, this feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Calm feels empty when chaos was the baseline. Jung described this as the withdrawal symptom of individuation. The nervous system has been calibrated to instability. Peace feels like loss. This is why many empaths attempt to recreate old dynamics unconsciously. They may feel drawn back to intensity, to emotional volatility, to people who destabilize them. Jung cautioned that this pull is not intuition, it is withdrawal. The psyche adjusting to a new baseline. Staying conscious during this phase is critical. The empath must learn to tolerate stability, to remain present in calm, to resist the urge to self-sabotage alignment. Jung emphasized patience here. The psyche does not recalibrate overnight. Years of hypervigilance do not dissolve instantly. But with time, the empath system learns a new language. Safety, reciprocity, mutual presence. This is when attraction truly transforms. Not just who arrives, but who stays. Only those capable of emotional responsibility remain. Those who expect regulation, rescue, or endless understanding fade away. Not through conflict, through irrelevance. The empath no longer fits their needs. And this is not rejection, it is accuracy. Jung believed this phase marked the transition from individuation to contribution. The empath is no longer focused on survival. They are oriented toward expression. Creativity returns, clarity sharpens, purpose emerges. Energy once spent on managing others becomes available for building life. This is why healed empaths often feel late. Late to themselves, late to their potential, late to joy. Jung addressed this grief directly. He wrote that mourning the unlived life is unavoidable, but necessary. You grieve what you sacrificed, then you reclaim what remains. The empath does not become someone new. They recover who they were before adaptation. This recovery is quiet, uncelebrated, but absolute. And it changes everything. Jung observed that the integrated empath develops a radically different relationship with truth. Before healing, truth was negotiable, filtered, softened. After healing, truth becomes structural, not weaponized, not performative, simply present. The empath no longer feels compelled to convince. They no longer chase understanding. They state, they act, they move on. This is deeply unsettling to unconscious systems, because those systems depend on negotiation, on emotional leverage, on confusion. The healed empath provides none of it. Jung described this as the collapse of unconscious contracts. Contracts that were never spoken but always enforced. I carry your pain, you tolerate my existence. I absorb your chaos, you allow me proximity. When the empath stops signing these contracts, the system destabilizes. Some people respond with hostility, others with pleading, others with sudden remorse. Jung was explicit. Do not confuse reaction with transformation. Real change does not arrive theatrically. It arrives quietly, sustainably. The empath must learn discernment here. Not everyone who reacts is awakening. Some are simply losing access. Jung warned that guilt is the final weapon of unconscious control. You've changed. You're not who you used to be. You're selfish now. These statements are not observations, they are strategies. Attempts to re-anchor the empath to the old role. The integrated empath does not argue with these accusations. They recognize them. And recognition removes their power. Jung believed that psychological maturity expresses itself through non-engagement. You do not fight distortion, you outgrow it. This is why healed empaths often appear unreachable. Not defensive, unhooked. They no longer resonate with manipulation, no longer vibrate at the frequency of chaos. This frequency shift is subtle, but decisive. It is felt before it is understood. This is what Jung meant when he said the psyche reorganizes itself around truth. Once organized, everything misaligned becomes obvious and unbearable. Not emotionally, energetically. The empath simply cannot remain where distortion exists. Their body rejects it. Their intuition disengages. They leave. Quietly, decisively. Without explanation. This is not avoidance, it is integrity. And integrity, once embodied, requires no justification. Jung emphasized that the final stage of this transformation is not power, but peace. Not dominance, not superiority. Sovereignty. The empath no longer seeks to be understood. They seek to be aligned. They no longer prioritize belonging. They prioritize coherence. This does not make them isolated, it makes them selective. Jung believed this selectivity was essential for psychological health. Without it, the psyche dissolves into the collective. With it, the individual becomes a stabilizing force. The sovereign empath does not absorb chaos. They expose it by refusing to carry it. They do not attack dysfunction. They simply stop enabling it. And this absence forces reckoning. Some people rise, some people fall away. Both outcomes are necessary. Jung believed that conscious individuals serve evolution precisely because they refuse unconscious participation. They become mirrors not through confrontation, but through presence. This presence is calm, grounded, unavailable for distortion. The empath's journey ends where it always should have begun, with self-trust. Trust in perception, trust in limits, trust in withdrawal when necessary. The empath no longer fears being alone. They fear betraying themselves. And this shift makes them untouchable. Not emotionally hardened, psychologically anchored. They can love deeply because they are no longer desperate for connection. They can walk away because they are no longer afraid of loss. Jung wrote that the individuated person stands alone, not because they reject others, but because they no longer need to merge to survive. This is the empath's true awakening. Not sensitivity, not suffering. Conscious choice. And once chosen, it cannot be undone. This is why the transformation feels terrifying. Because nothing built on self-denial survives it. Only truth remains. And truth, once embodied, changes everything. Jung emphasized that once the empath reaches this level of integration, their life reorganizes itself without effort. Not because circumstances magically improve, but because the empath no longer tolerates distortion. They do not negotiate with reality, they respond to it. This response is grounded, calm, and final. Opportunities that once felt unreachable begin to appear, not because the empath chases them, but because their clarity attracts coherence. Jung observed that integrated empaths often experience rapid external shifts after long internal stagnation. Careers realign, creative impulses resurface, relationships restructure. What looks like sudden luck is actually delayed consequence. Years of suppressed perception finally expressed through action. The empath no longer asks, "Is this allowed? Will this upset someone? Am I being too much?" They ask only one question. "Is this true for me?" This single filter replaces dozens of old survival calculations. And the psyche responds with relief. Jung described this relief as the end of internal civil war. The part that saw clearly and the part that pretended not to are finally unified. No more double consciousness, no more internal gaslighting. Just coherence. From this coherence emerges authority. Not authoritarianism, authority. The natural gravity of someone who trusts themselves. Others feel it immediately. They may not understand it, but they respect it. Unconsciously. Because authority grounded in self-trust cannot be manipulated. This is why integrated empaths are rarely challenged directly. People test boundaries indirectly. They probe, they hint, they observe. And when they realize there is no opening, no emotional leverage, no guilt hook, they adjust or retreat. Jung noted that this presence alters group dynamics without effort. The empath no longer stabilizes dysfunction. They destabilize it simply by refusing participation. Meetings become more honest, conversations more direct, tensions surface faster. Not because the empath provokes, but because suppression no longer has a container. This is the paradox Jung identified. The empath heals themselves and unintentionally heals systems. Not through intervention, through absence. Absence of enabling, absence of self-betrayal. This is individuation in action. This belief is deeply ingrained. From childhood, the empath learned they were praised when helpful, tolerated when quiet, rejected when authentic. Healing dismantles this conditioning at the root. The empath learns they do not exist to serve harmony. They exist to embody truth. Harmony emerges naturally from truth. It cannot be forced through sacrifice. Jung called this transition the shift from moral obedience to psychological integrity. The empath stops trying to be good. They focus on being real. This does not make them immoral. It makes them whole. They no longer perform compassion. They practice discernment. They no longer rescue. They respond when invited. They no longer soften truth to preserve connection. They allow connection to arise from truth. This is why many former relationships cannot survive integration. They were built on performance, on suppression, on asymmetry. Truth collapses structures that require distortion. Jung insisted this collapse is not failure, it is correction. The empath does not destroy relationships. They reveal whether a relationship was ever real. This realization brings grief, but also liberation. Grief for what was hoped, liberation from what was endured. Jung emphasized allowing both. Do not rush grief, do not pathologize sadness. Mourning is evidence of depth. But do not mistake mourning for regression. You are not going backward, you are shedding skin. And skin always resists removal. The empath who honors this process emerges quieter, clearer, and profoundly grounded. They stop explaining themselves. Not because they are closed, but because explanation implies doubt. They no longer doubt. This is when the empath becomes unmistakable. Not loud, not intense. Unmistakable. Because they are finally congruent. Inside and out. Jung believed this congruence was the true marker of psychological health. Not happiness, not productivity. Alignment. And alignment, once achieved, becomes the empath's greatest protection. Jung concluded that individuals who complete this process are no longer governed by fear of abandonment. They understand something fundamental. Anyone who requires your self-erasure to stay was never offering love. Only access. This understanding dissolves desperation. The empath no longer clings, they choose. They choose who enters their life, they choose how close, they choose when to withdraw. These choices are not reactions, they are expressions of sovereignty. Jung believed sovereignty was the highest psychological achievement. Not independence from others, but independence from unconscious compulsion. The empath can now engage deeply without losing themselves. They can walk away without collapsing. They can love without surrendering authority. This balance was once impossible. Now it is natural. The nervous system has recalibrated. Chaos no longer excites. Intensity no longer seduces. Drama no longer signals importance. Peace becomes the new reference point. And peace is selective. It rejects noise, it repels manipulation, it dissolves urgency. The empath becomes patient. Not passive, patient. They wait for resonance, they move when alignment appears. This patience feels threatening to those who rely on pressure. But it is simply self-respect embodied. Jung believed that when enough individuals reach this state, culture shifts. Because unconscious systems cannot survive without emotional laborers. When empaths stop absorbing, systems must evolve or collapse. This is why Jung saw individuation not as personal luxury, but as collective necessity. The empath's healing is not selfish. It is corrective. And it begins, as it always has, with one decision. To trust what you see, to honor what you feel, to stop apologizing for clarity. This is the end of the old role. And the beginning of conscious life. Jung observed that after integration, the empath's inner dialogue changes completely. The constant questioning disappears. Am I wrong? Am I imagining this? Am I too sensitive? These questions no longer arise because perception has proven itself repeatedly. What replaces doubt is calibration. The empath no longer scans for approval, they scan for coherence. Does this environment feel clean or distorted? Does this interaction expand or contract my nervous system? Does this path require self-betrayal to continue? These are not emotional questions. They are perceptual ones. And perceptual questions demand honesty, not justification. Jung wrote that once the psyche no longer wastes energy defending false attachments, a tremendous amount of vitality is released. This vitality often surprises the empath. They suddenly have energy again, Not manic energy, grounded energy. The kind that allows sustained focus, creative flow, and decisive action. Jung saw this as the psyche reclaiming stolen resources. For years, those resources were siphoned into managing others' emotions, anticipating conflict, softening truths, and preventing collapse. Now that energy returns home. This return can feel disorienting at first. The empath may feel restless, as if they should be fixing something. But there is nothing broken anymore. What feels unfamiliar is peace without vigilance. Jung warned not to fill this space with new obligations. Rest here. This stillness is not emptiness, it is integration settling. From this stillness, the empath's true orientation emerges. Not what they should do, but what they are naturally drawn toward. Jung believed this attraction reveals the soul's direction. Not desire driven by lack, but movement driven by alignment. When the empath follows this pull, life reorganizes with surprising efficiency. Less resistance, fewer crises, cleaner endings. This is not because life becomes easy. It becomes honest. And honesty removes friction. They no longer avoid it. They no longer seek it. They allow it to reveal itself. Conflict becomes diagnostic rather than threatening. If tension appears, the empath observes. Is this tension rooted in truth or in someone's discomfort with being seen? If it is rooted in truth, they engage calmly. If it is rooted in avoidance, they disengage completely. This discernment is devastating to manipulative dynamics. There is no argument to win, no emotion to hijack, no guilt to exploit. Jung called this state psychological neutrality. Not indifference, neutrality. The empath is no longer pulled into others' storms. They can stand beside pain without absorbing it. They can witness collapse without becoming responsible for repair. This is often misinterpreted as coldness. But Jung clarified the difference. Coldness is withdrawal from feeling. Neutrality is mastery of it. The empath still feels deeply. They simply no longer confuse feeling with obligation. This distinction protects the psyche from exhaustion. It also protects others from dependency. Jung observed that people around integrated empaths either mature rapidly or disappear. Both outcomes are healthy. Those willing to grow rise to meet the new standard. Those unwilling seek easier mirrors elsewhere. The empath does not chase either. They remain steady. And steadiness is the rarest presence in an unconscious world. Praise no longer inflates. Blame no longer destabilizes. Both are received as data. Neither defines identity. This neutrality terrifies people who rely on emotional leverage. Because leverage requires reactivity. The integrated empath offers none. They listen, they assess, they respond, or not. Jung described this as the end of psychological hooks. Nothing sticks. Compliments do not seduce. Criticism does not wound. Only truth registers. This does not make the empath arrogant, it makes them accurate. Accuracy replaces defensiveness. And defensiveness is what once drained them most. Without it, conversations shorten, explanations disappear, boundaries become implicit. Jung wrote that implicit boundaries are the strongest kind. They do not need to be announced, they are felt. People sense where the line is and stop before crossing it. This is why integrated empaths rarely need to say no. Their presence already says it. At the same time, their presence also says yes. Yes to depth, yes to honesty, yes to mutual responsibility. This clarity attracts a very specific kind of person. Those who are done hiding. Those who are tired of games. Those who are willing to be seen. These connections are fewer but infinitely cleaner. Jung believed one authentic relationship outweighs 100 distorted ones. Quality restores the psyche in ways quantity never could. Jung warned that society does not reward this transformation immediately. Integrated empaths often experience a period of invisibility. They are no longer entertaining dysfunction. They are no longer performing roles. So they may seem less useful to systems built on exploitation. This invisibility is temporary. It is the psyche recalibrating its external alignment. New environments require new coordinates. During this phase, Jung advised patients, do not return to old roles out of fear. Do not soften yourself to be included again. What excluded you was never meant to sustain you. Jung saw many patients fail here. They mistook loneliness for error and retreated back into self-erasure. Those who endured this phase emerged into environments that required no self-betrayal. Workplaces that valued insight, relationships that honored boundaries, communities that welcomed truth. These spaces could not appear earlier, because the empath could not recognize them yet. Integration changes perception, and perception determines selection. You do not find better environments. You become able to enter them. This is why Jung insisted that individuation precedes destiny. You do not choose your life path consciously. You become it psychologically. And life follows. It was about becoming whole in the presence of oneself. The greatest danger for the empath was never manipulation, abuse, or betrayal. It was self-abandonment disguised as virtue. The moment the empath stops abandoning their own perception, their own boundaries, their own truth, the entire psychological landscape changes. Not because the world transforms, but because the empath is no longer negotiating reality. They are standing inside it. Jung believed this was the true meaning of individuation. Not becoming special, not becoming superior, but becoming internally aligned. When alignment is achieved, the psyche no longer fractures under pressure. It bends without breaking. It observes without absorbing. It feels without dissolving. This is sovereignty. Not control over others, but authority over one's inner world. The integrated empath does not seek revenge. They do not seek validation. They do not seek explanation. They simply withdraw their energy from what cannot meet them in truth. And this withdrawal is not punishment, it is correction. Correction of a lifetime spent carrying what was never theirs to carry. Jung wrote that consciousness evolves not through domination, but through differentiation. The empath's role in this evolution is not to save the world, but to stop feeding its unconscious patterns. By refusing to absorb distortion, they force clarity. By choosing themselves without apology, they model a new psychological posture. By standing calmly in truth, they expose illusion without violence. This is why the empath's transformation feels terrifying to those who benefited from their silence, and liberating to those who were ready to awaken. You were never meant to disappear, you were meant to return. Return to your perception. Return to your boundaries. Return to your center. Your sensitivity was never the wound. Your denial of it was. And now that denial is over, this is not the end of your journey. It is the moment your journey finally becomes yours.